I'm Sarah Graham and welcome to my course, The Art of Baking. During the next 6 lessons, we are going to walk you through all the baking basics around cakes and cookies, breads and pastries to give you all the tips and tricks and confidence that you need to really get cracking in the kitchen. I love giving people the information and inspiration that they need to get off their couches and into their kitchens. And it kind of feels like the world is a little bit feverish with the fancy for baking at the moment, and I think it's a great thing. We can very easily become besotted with this whole hurry, flurry pace of life, and I think baking is a kind of calm that we crave. But a lot of people are intimidated by it. So we're going to take away the mystery and replace it with very simple science. And we've got a whole world of online resources, from troubleshooting guides to top tips to extra recipes and some really fun quizzes as well. So if you couldn't already tell, we want to leave you with no excuse not to get baking. To kick off our introduction to the art of baking, I'm going to walk you through our 10 golden rules that are helpful to keep in mind when you approach any baking scenario. And I'm going to do that by demonstrating an easy espresso cake with mocha buttercream, which really is just fancy talk for a coffee-flavored sponge cake that has a coffee and chocolate flavored icing. The first thing that you need to keep in mind is always read the recipe through from start to finish before you do anything. And I'm a classic culprit in this case because I always rush into things and get over enthusiastic, and then I'll end up halfway through a recipe and I'll be missing some vital ingredient. The second thing to keep in mind is always grease and prepare your baking tins or baking trays or loaf tins according to the instructions in the recipe. So here I have 2 standard 20 centimeter cake tins, and I'm just going to lightly brush them with melted butter. The third rule to keep in mind is to make sure that you have all your ingredients and equipment laid out before you start. That way you can run a slick assembly line from your mixing bowl to the oven, and most importantly, from the oven to your plate or your fork. So the first thing I'm going to do is weigh out 225 grams of butter and 225 grams of caster sugar. And it's really important to make sure that you're accurate in your weighing. It can make a massive difference to the quality of your cake or your cookie or your bread. Just reset the scale back to 0, and then we're going to add in 225 grams of caster sugar. Now we take this over to the mixer and we start the creaming process, which is just whipping together the butter and the sugar until it's really well incorporated and really light and fluffy. Just keep going for anywhere between 3 and 5 minutes. While that's creaming and turning into something lovely and light, I am going to weigh out the dry ingredients. And it's another tip that's really important to remember is to take the time to weigh and measure your ingredients accurately. It can make a world of difference to whatever you're baking. Try as far as possible to use the best quality ingredients that you can afford. You really can taste the difference. So what I need is 225 grams of self-raising flour. There's some real science going on behind the ingredients in any baked good, and it's really helpful to know who the main players are and what they do. Flour is used as a thickener, and also it gives us gluten, which is a stretchy protein that holds the structure of a cake or a cookie or bread together. If you overwork the flour or the gluten, then you would end up with a tough cake. That's why you never want to overmix a cake, but you can save your gluten-inducing elbow grease for things like breads, where you really want the gluten to shine and you really want that strong crumb texture and the strength of the protein to come out. The next thing I need to do is add in 1 level teaspoon of baking powder. Baking powder and baking soda are known as chemical leaveners, which means they give off air bubbles and carbon dioxide once they're activated in the mixture, and that gives anything that you're baking lovely lightness and air. Sieving them together like this will mean that the baking powder is evenly distributed in the flour, and that's a good thing. And then just a little pinch of salt, and obviously if you're using salted butter, then you don't need to add the extra pinch of salt. Okay, so now we're ready to start adding our dry ingredients along with the eggs to the butter and sugar mixture. Eggs for me are one of the most magical ingredients in baking. They solidify when they're cooked, so that helps things like cakes and tart fillings to set. When eggs are beaten, they add lightness to things that you're baking, and they also contain fat, which adds a lovely richness and depth of flavor. Now I'm adding in 2 eggs, and then about half the flour, and then the coffee flavoring, and then the remaining 2 eggs and flour, just so that everything mixes together nicely. Okay, the eggs and the flour have just combined, and now I need to add in our espresso flavoring, which is just the instant coffee granules that I mixed together with about a tablespoon of hot water. So it's 2.5 teaspoons of instant coffee, about a tablespoon of hot water. Okay. So you just add that in and scrape down if you need to. That's nicely mixed together now, and that beautiful caramel coffee color has completely taken over. So now all you need to do is divide the cake batter between your 2 cake tins. I just like to smooth it out using the back of a spoon. Or you could use a spatula or a palette knife, whatever you have handy. Now our cakes are ready to go into the oven to be turned into something glorious. And our oven has been preheated to 190 degrees Celsius. And preheating is really important so that the cakes go into the oven when it's at the right temperature. And some ovens read hot or cold. So to get around all the quirks and foibles of your oven, one little trick that you can do is insert a separate oven thermometer, which tells you what the actual temperature is. Really important to keep your eye on the clock when you've got something baking in the oven. And one thing I can recommend is to set a timer and disappear and go and do something else, because otherwise you'll end up like me, which is staring into the oven and willing the cake to rise faster. Once your cake or cookies or bread or tart have been in the oven for the minimum recommended cooking time, then you can start checking to see whether they're done or not. And for a cake, all you need to do is simply insert a skewer or a sharp knife into the center of the cake, and if it comes out clean, then it's done. So the skewers come out clean, which means we're golden. Once your cakes have cooled for a minute or 2 minutes in the cake tin, then you gently coax them out of the cake tin and just place the cake onto a cooling rack, which means that you get even air circulation around the cake and it can cool evenly. And then make sure that you leave the cakes to cool completely before you try and ice them, because if they're still too hot when you start icing them, you'll end up with a puddle of icing all over the kitchen counter and it's not pretty. Thanks for hanging out with us for the last few minutes. I hope that we've given you the inspiration to give baking a bash. And remember that everything we've gone through is available in more detail in the course notes, as well as extra recipes and a clever quiz to test your knowledge. So I'll see you in the next lesson.